Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Revamped Founder. In this episode, we have Joseph Jacks joining us. Joseph is the founder and general partner of OSS Capital, which is the world's first early stage VC firm dedicated towards commercial open source software companies, or COSS companies in short. Joseph is also the founder of the Open Core Summit, the global COSS ecosystem conference run independently as a vendor neutral community that includes leading investment firms, cloud providers, cost companies, etc. In this episode, we talk about what is open source, the philosophy of open source AI, how to build a open source company, more specifically a cost company, how to practically manage a cost company, what is COSS, FOSS, free and open source software, and so much more. This is an incredible episode and do listen to it till the very end. Thank you.
So, hey Joseph, how are you? It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I hope you're doing well.
Thank you, Advik, for inviting me. I'm doing well. And how are you doing?
Yep, I'm absolutely fine. So, I think
Great.
let's get into it. So, what is open source?
So open source means a lot of different things to different people. But for me, I would boil it down to it's a way of building technology that is discrimination free and permissive for anyone to participate in the process of the creation, as well as take control over the output of that process. Originally, open source was called free software, and it was invented by a gentleman by the name of Richard Stallman in the early 1980s. And this was motivated by Richard basically being very upset, or the more blunt way is, being pissed off about proprietary operating systems, proprietary software in particular. So there was Unix and a lot of proprietary technology development kind of bubbling up in that time frame. And Richard developed a philosophy and a point of view that proprietary software was actually evil and morally wrong. So if you can imagine taking this point of view and being so convinced about it, this motivated him to invent a framework, a manifesto, a licensing model, actually a lot of software himself as well, that would serve to be the inverse or the opposite of proprietary software. And so the first thing he looked at was the copyright system in the United States, which is the way we actually govern intellectual property. And he came up with this term, which is the opposite of copyright, sort of tongue-in-cheek, called copyleft. Right, and so that was the sort of origin of open source. Richard is ideologue, very philosophically, kind of motivated by this. And so in the late 90s, about 15 years after free software was invented by Richard, there was a group of people, Tim O'Reilly, Larry Augustin, Bruce Perens, a few other people, came together and they rebranded the term open source, free software, and they decided to call it open source. Basically building on all the same concepts, not changing anything fundamental, but just, sort of saying like, look, we love this vision, but it's a little bit too religious and ideological. And so, and also we think a better term is this thing called open source, because mostly these ideas are applied to source code. That was the origin of the thing that we know today is called open source, right? So a group of people rebranded. It was a marketing rebranding in 1998. And the rest is history. So in 98, as you probably know, that was the early days of the internet. The internet started to take off in a big way, and then the internet massively changed the world. And really open source projects, open source licensing of source code technology, digital technology, computer source code, was largely driven by this paradigm, by this open source development model. And I would say if you were to ask the founders of every major internet scale company, whether it's the founders of Google or Meta or Twitter or even Apple, many others, they would tell you their companies would not have been possible without the contributions and the gift that open source provides the entire technology industry. So for me, I think of open source in a more abstract way. When I really started to understand open source and free software and the origins of all of this, I didn't just think of it in the context of source code. I thought of it more in the context of how this idea and philosophy could be applied to anything. So like when you're engineering a watch, or you're writing an architecture for a new building, or you're creating a new, you're synthesizing a new design for a new drug. It doesn't just have to be computer software source code. It could be the instructions and the details and the ingredients for creating anything with sufficient complexity, right? So computer software source code is just the instructions that we tell the computer that govern what the computer does for us on our behalf, right? So sort of directions, right? Now that's changing quite a lot in this new world we're headed into with artificial intelligence, because we have models that are not deterministic really, and they're doing different things every time we tell them to do something. They're producing a different output, right? So Stable Diffusion or models like Llama or ChatGPT is, they're creating basically stochastic and randomized outputs based on the learning process of the data that they were exposed to. This is very different, and I think does require some additional evolution of our understanding of open source and the application of open source. And so if you were to ask me this question a year ago, I would give you the answer I gave you. But if you ask me today, I have to give you all that context, because AI is kind of changing our understanding and our perspective of kind of everything in terms of the future evolution of the technology industry.
Yeah, that was the best description of opens that I ever heard. So I think I'll go back to the point about rigid that you were talking about. So what is the discrimination in open source that rigid faced, apparently, quote unquote?
Well, I think the idea of removing discrimination, which was the sort of design, the fundamental design, was really in service of providing maximum freedom and maximum liberty for anyone to have control over the process of creation, as well as the process of evaluation and transparency to understand things at a deep level. And I think the same concepts are applied to things like the Gutenberg Press or the creation of open access to books or scientific knowledge or math or fundamental science. I think the same kind of spirit drove that particular design, and so you always have the trade-off of there's bad people in the world, there's evil people in the world, and they could take access to these insights and these learnings and cause harm for society. But the reality is, open source free software would not work at any level if they were discriminating against any particular kind of human being, because you can't know for sure what the decision will be of a human being when interacting with a technology. Technology, I believe, and I believe that Richard was probably motivated by this to some extent, but there's a lot of things that Richard has said and does that I don't agree with. But I don't think of technology as having morals or ethics, right? And so it's very important to kind of think about if you want to create maximum innovation and freedom for technology, you have to make the technology permissively available for anyone at any time without discriminating who they are and where they come from and what they're doing, right? And so that's a very, very critical aspect to how free software open source works in general. There's quite a lot of resistance to this idea, in particular with the rise of AI models that are very powerful and that could do some pretty incredible things. And so this is, I think, a big part of the reason why most of the large and powerful models that are released are really not open source. It doesn't matter whether a company says it's open source. If you look at the license, they're discriminating against usage in many different areas. That's not an open source license. It's a proprietary license. There's really two types of technology licenses. There's ones that are open source and there's ones that are not open source, right? And so it is a very binary thing. Specifically because of the sort of the freedoms that Richard was very explicit about, including in the original creation of this philosophy, this way of building technology, and the freedoms. If I can summarize them, Richard's a computer scientist, so he starts with zero. Freedom zero. There's 4 freedoms, so 0, 1, 2, and 3. But sometimes I forget the order of the freedoms, but it's basically the freedom to see the technology transparently and sort of evaluate it and view it. The second, another freedom would be to run the technology or execute the technology anytime for any purpose. The third freedom would be to modify, change the technology, and then I think the fourth freedom would be to distribute and share and copy basically the technology or the source code with changes or without changes. And so there's a lot of licenses that sort of exist in the open source world. Some of them include aspects of those freedoms more aggressively and more permissively than others, but all open source licenses essentially have to adhere to those 4 essential freedoms. And if those freedoms are not allowed permissively without discrimination, then something is not open source, essentially.
Yeah. What we saw with OpenAI, they started out as a non-profit open source company, but turned into a for-profit closed source company. So why do you think was that? Why did they not open source the whole model, or did they?
Well, they had an intention to, and Sam founded the company with Elon and Ilya Sutskever and Greg Brockman and a few other people who were very intent on purely following a fully open source approach, right? All the research would be open source. Company would actually not have a business model. It would be nonprofit, purely philanthropic, essentially. And this definitely upset a lot of people. But when Sam decided to kind of completely change the fundamental structure of the company and decide to go in the other direction, I think the justification was both equal parts deceitful, duplicitous, conniving, whatever words you want to use, and in a lie, I believe, right? And so the justification specifically was we believe these models are going to present an existential threat to humanity, and as a consequence, they need to be proprietary. When people say open source AI, I'll ramble on just a little bit here. I'm sure you weren't intending on talking about this so much in this interview.
No, go ahead.
Open source AI is not really possible. Open source AI is not technically, it doesn't really make sense. And I'll explain the reason for this. So, AI today, in our current sort of incarnation of it and the way it's designed, is based on these. You could say data structures, but I'm not sure there's the sort of computer science equivalent for this, computing paradigm rather, called neural networks. And so neural networks produce outputs that are basically large matrices of mathematical tensor numbers, and those numbers are not you can't really evaluate them and what they do and why they do what they do in the same way that you can looking at a Python function, for example. You can look at a Python function, you can understand what the Python function does because you can write the Python function by hand. You can see what the instructions say and all of that. And you can have a really strong understanding of what it's going to do when you invoke the function, and what it's going to output. With a neural network model, you can have some rough approximation of what is likely to happen based on the training data, but we don't yet have models that give us the same level of precision about understandability and how and why they produce the outputs anywhere near as detailed as we do with computer source code, right? And so this is the reason why I say open source AI doesn't really make sense, because you can't. So neural network weights and parameters, they're not source code. There's something else. Source code in most definitions is code either generated by a machine, and you can read the output of the machine. You can understand what the source code is doing, or the binary, even the binary or the machine code is doing, or in I think majority of cases you can see the source code because human hand wrote it, and you can modify and evaluate what it does because a human actually wrote the source code by hand. None of those things are true with the neural network weights and neural network parameters. And so my partner, Heather Meeker, and I came up with this post a month or two ago, maybe a couple months ago. And it was basically trying to create a discussion around this notion of what we call open weights. So as opposed to saying open source, you would say open weights, right? And so you can make the weights of a model transparently accessible and visible, and essentially reproducible by basically sharing them and making that available publicly and transparently. And so that sort of gets us closer to this notion of open source. But there's still a lot missing in terms of, specifically what Richard kind of coined and invented in the 80s, which is, you're free to modify in part or in whole. You're free to run, anywhere, and you're free to, visibly inspect and read. The visibly inspect and read and see, aspect kind of doesn't make sense, because humans are not able to actually decipher and understand what the weights represent by looking at them. It's a big grid of numbers. We have no idea. The reproduce and modify aspect is also somewhat like not redundant, but like irrelevant, because you don't directly modify the weights of a neural network in order to recompute the tensor values in the neural network. You have to basically either fine tune the network or retrain the network. There's probably a bunch of other methods that exist, but you're sort of doing that by indirection as opposed to sort of directly modifying and going and saying, I'm going to go and, for the 4 billionth 986 millionth particular parameter, I'm going to change the value. Like that's not really going to do anything, right? As opposed to going into like a GitHub project on GitHub and going into the Python core and then going to the folder that implements the sort of address lookup function or something and saying, okay, well, we're going to do it a little bit differently here, and that's actually going to change the functionality of the program. Like, it doesn't exist like that. So we need to actually think from first principles and think in terms of like kind of critically about how to provide the same freedoms and the same permissiveness that free software and open source have given us with software source code, But how do we do that with neural network weights, neural network parameters? And again, the post that I wrote with my partner Heather Meeker a couple months ago, the attempt is to really start the conversation around that and encourage people to sort of think critically. And basically, we don't believe that open source AI is a practical or realistic or even accurate or possible description of things.
Okay, so say on these lines, if you look at it this way in terms of the neural network, the weights part that you mentioned, then nothing is open source because you change the source code, but you can't actually either view the binary that the computer actually understands. So in that case, is anything even completely open source?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets us a lot closer to being able to control the technology, and so the idea of open source and free software, even though the implementation details would be a little bit different because its primary artifact that open source is applied to is computer source code.
Yeah,
the ideas are very, I think, preservable. They just require some changes in the primitives of how you go about unlocking those freedoms and those liberties, essentially, right? You do make a good point. Like even if you have the weights available, there's a question of is that possible for someone to really make use of? Do they have the ability to understand how to modify those things or reproduce them, or there's a lot of technical barriers that I think are a lot higher than the technical barriers for your average computer user of the 4 billion computer users on Earth. Maybe there's 20 million or 30 million who are actually skilled enough to write computer code and even understand open source, right? And so actually even the open source world is very tiny because there's a technical skill necessary to actually appreciate, okay, right, like if my if my social network application I'm using to talk to my friends is open source versus not, if I don't know how to code, or if I don't know how computers really work, it doesn't matter to me. Like I don't care, right? All I care about is the app, does it work? Click the button, I talk to my friends. And so most people don't have the technical skill to even appreciate why open source actually matters. I personally believe that this is much more tractable and solvable challenge than the open source weights or open weights or open AI versus AI discussion. There's a lot more complexity with that, but I think that there's still a lot of opportunity to sort of think critically about how we can unlock and allow similar permissiveness and similar freedoms for these models. And I think we kind of have, right? Like, stable diffusion is not open source. A lot of people think it's open source. It's not, but it gives you very similar mechanisms to be in control of the process. So I was going to say free software, open source are really about, switching the paradigm. The world before free software, before Richard basically came along, was, the software controls the user, right? You're using this thing and it's a black box, and you can only do what the creator of that technology allowed you to do, right? Whereas if something became free software or open source, it was freed from the shackles or the control of the creator. The user could also be the creator, right? And so all of a sudden the user is now in control of the software as opposed to the user being controlled by the software, right? And so I think that there's similar dynamics possible with AI, and I think we're still in the very early stages of figuring a lot of that out.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting one. Actually, never heard that before. So moving on to, you mentioned about free software, FOSS, basically free and open source software. So is a free in in free and open source software, is the free actually applicable to the cost of the software or the philosophical nature of the software?
Yeah, it's more of a philosophical term. Part of the reason why open source came about and was rebranding free software is because the word free in English in English means something very different than the word free in Hindi, than the word free in Japanese, than the word free in Korean, than the word free in Arabic, and the word free in Italian, and so on and so forth. And there isn't a lot of consistent definitional clarity across societies, across languages, across cultures of the word free. That's one issue. The second issue is within even the Western world, English speaking, say United States, the word free actually means a lot of different things to a lot of different people as well, right? It sometimes it means that you're going to get some free free meal. Sometimes it means you're going to get a free ticket pass to a concert. Sometimes it means you're going to get a free hug. But the cost of those things is actually different, both from the perspective of the creator of the thing that is made free, as well as the recipient of the thing that they got for free, right? And so this is part of the reason why open source came about as a term, is it made more practical and definitional sense in terms of how the words are constructed and applied. And so it was sort of a less confusing and more practical phrase that served to kind of encapsulate a lot of these principles. And so the source being open, and then the source obviously being source, made I think more sense at that point, which is why it's a handful of smart people that came up with this phrase and this term. I actually believe that open source itself even has a lot of challenges as a term, right, as a phrase, because we have the same problem with the word open. What does open mean? Open is kind of subjective. Your definition of open is different than my definition of open, right? And so, but how open? Is it all the way open, or is it only a little bit open? So there's a lot of nuance here that I think a lot of people gloss over, and this is part of the reason why I think open source is used very loosely and in a very sort of sloppy way in instances where it's technically incorrect. Furthermore, I think the final part to this would be going back to something I said earlier. As AI sort of changes everything in the entire technology industry, the definition or the meaning of source code changes fundamentally, and we don't really have the same concepts available in terms of our familiarity with this thing called computer source code, because AI models are actually not the same as source code. So
that's a very good point. So I think we'll move on to the more practical side of things. We talked a lot about theory and the coming about of the whole open source narrative, but what is the difference between open source, then commercial open source software, and FOSS, free or open source software? These three, where does the line between these three change?
Sure. So I coined this acronym called COSS, COSS, which is another confusing term. And I've probably said this thousands of times, but I think when you introduce anything new, you have to say it a million times, maybe 10 million times before people really start to understand it, which is fine. Commercial open source software is not a different kind of software being open source. There's two types of software. It's closed source and open source. There is no gradient in between. You can be a little bit open source or not. That makes no sense, right? So that setting that aside, the term COSS does not refer to a type of open source. It does not say this open source is commercial and this other open source is not commercial. That is not the distinction. Okay? The distinction actually refers to a type of company. So COSS, or commercial open source software, really refers to a type of company. And so it's actually really important to kind of make this distinction. Companies are not technology. companies are stories. Companies are stories. Companies are, you think of them as sort of truths or lies, depending on your perspective. They're inventions, figments of our imagination, right? By the way, the same is kind of true with software, source code to a certain extent. But
Yeah.
let's just
Yeah.
focus on things that are technology versus things that are not technology. I guess I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but this is somewhat of a deeper distinction. For me, I don't view companies as a technology. I view companies as a sort of intermediary mechanism for allowing humans to exchange value between each other. But I don't view them as technology in and of itself. I guess you could probably say, if you look at the most deep definition of what technology actually means, companies could be a technology that we invented back when the Dutch East India Company was created initially, several hundred years ago, and that was the sort of original idea of modern capitalism. But I think it's important to say, in the context of this commercial open source term, that companies are not a technology. And the reason I say that is open source is really only applied to technology. You can really only think of open source as making sense when you apply it to a technology. Everything that is not technology is either already open source because it's just sort of freely understood what the concept is and you can do what you want with it, or it doesn't really make sense to open source something like that. And there's very few things out there that you could say, fit that particular definition or that mold. And so for me, to make this a little bit more concrete, in the same way that you sort of look at there's software that is open source and software that is not open source.
Yeah.
I think of there's companies that are open core or commercial open source or COSS, and there's companies that are not. Right? There's sort of exactly two types of companies. And as companies become more and more and more complex and larger, this definition starts to evolve and change a little bit. But just for the sake of discussion, COSS company is a company that exists because of and only because of the coexistence of some open source technology, right? And so by example, I'll give you many examples. Red Hat would not exist without the coexistence of this open source technology, which is not a company, called Linux. Confluent would not exist without the coexistence of this open source technology called Apache Kafka. And so on and so forth. Many examples. And the sort of the first principles way I look at this is, and this obviously changes and evolves depending on decisions that humans make, is closed core versus open core companies. Closed core companies are ones that have the core technology is proprietary, and no one can modify or distribute or see or make use of that technology except that one company. So closed core companies, the core technology is tightly coupled to that company. Whereas open core companies or commercial open source companies, the core technology is loosely coupled to the company. And so that one detail causes all of these differences on all these different levels, different dimensions. And it actually changes everything. There's sort of a different species of company. Open core companies, they're sort of like a butterfly organism versus closed core companies are sort of like a organism from the mammalian kind of family, like a dog or something, right? They're so different. They're so fundamentally different. And that's really been my deep kind of observation and perspective that I really started to kind of learn and develop strong points of view around maybe a decade ago. And I started blogging and writing about these ideas, which you mentioned you read a lot of the blogs maybe 5 or 6 years ago or 6-7 years ago. And then I started OSS Capital 5 years ago to basically implement this perspective systematically by investing in companies and helping companies pursue this model. So yeah, that's kind of the long-winded answer to what is the difference between commercial open source. It's a type of company. FOSS is sort of the union of free software and open source. A lot of people just say open source. That is a type of technology, right?
Yeah.
Type of technology being open source or not. COSS, or commercial open source companies, or you could say open core companies, is a type of company. It's not a type of technology.
Yeah, like you worked at Tandem, which you say is a open core company. So is open core or closed core a subpart of COSS or COSS company?
All COSS companies are open core.
Yeah, exactly. That's that. So why create a COSS company? What is in it for anyone in general? More of moving like forward from the philosophical nature of creating an open source company, freedom to the users, to the creators. Why create a COSS company or an open company? Why not work like OpenAI? Take a jab at them.
Sure. Well, it's a personal decision. You really have to think about what you believe is best for the world and what you think is the best way to build your particular product or service. I personally don't have a super strong, like moral or ethical lens on this.
Yeah.
Probably deep down, I would say it's morally and ethically the best thing to do to start an open core company. But I actually don't really think of it as like a religious, like moral right or wrong, good or bad kind of approach. I think you can build a fully proprietary company that is, designed in a way where it's very inclusive and helpful and good for the world and valuable and so on. And you can build an open core company by the same token that actually does things in a way that maybe harms its users or is damaging, right? And is not run with the right leadership for encouraging a positive kind of impact to society and for its users. And so I really try to sort of decouple the human behavior and human decisions that result in the outcomes from the design of a system, right? And so the system itself stands on its own. It is what it is. But the humans, then they come into the system and they make decisions that doesn't matter what the design of the system is. They can make decisions that are harmful or that are good and positive and beneficial. And so I think why someone would choose to create an open source company or a COSS company would be, driven by their own belief systems and by their own, convictions. I was tweeting something earlier, which is, something that was just on my mind. Your belief systems govern your reality. What you believe in controls what is real to you. That is, I think, a fundamental truth. Starting a company is very hard. It's an extremely difficult journey and process. It requires a lot of other attributes and skills and traits that are kind of unrelated to open source. It requires a huge amount of passion and conviction and skill and dedication and determination and a lot of things that most people don't really want to develop, as well as things that they'll likely never have, right? Just for various reasons. And so I think totally independent of, what kind of company do I want to create? Is it an open source company or some proprietary thing? You really have to be very clear, like, are you actually, aware of the challenges and the difficulty of creating a company where you're working for yourself and you have to basically create everything from zero, and you're responsible for quite a lot. Like, very few people are really prepared and ready for that kind of journey.
So is open source just others committing code to your GitHub? Is that all open source means, or how much of that is really a part of creating a open core company, as you put it?
It's part of it, but it's not necessary, nor is it sufficient for success. And I would say external contribution to open source projects is a very good indicator of the fact that you've built something that people resonate with and they care about and they think is really useful for their lives, and that can actually make their lives better, and they think that can help them with their career, help them learn new skills. But open source is there's kind of a counterintuitive aspect to open source, which is it's not one thing. It's actually many things. And depending on the situation, open source can be a collection of many different things with different levels of intensity, right? So it can be, very, important that the technology is transparent and accessible, but it doesn't really matter too much if people are contributing to it. Whereas in another situation, open source could be all about external contribution and getting more participation and contribution. And, obviously a prerequisite for that is transparency and the fact that it's visible, but that's not as big of a sort of emphasis. It's just as open source. Both situations are equally open source. And so that's something that actually took me many years to really appreciate, is there are certain things in life where the definition is equally true on a number of variables, but the implementation of that definition could look different depending on the situation. But that doesn't mean the definition changed. It doesn't mean that the definition is different across those different situations, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point too. So open source is not about all the GitHub commits or the GitHub stars that you get. Yeah, it's not about all that. So how do you build a company which is open source, like practically? We talked a lot about the theory and the philosophical point of view, but practically speaking, how do you create an open core company?
Well, I invest and help build a specific type of open source company. And so I can tell you the kind of approach that I take.
Exactly.
When I invest in a project or a company, I think pretty hard, and I evaluate a lot of different things that bring me to the conviction and the belief. Again, belief governs all reality. That I think the company could be worth many, many billions of dollars in the future, right? There are more open source projects that have maintainers, creators that want to create a company, maybe by a factor of 100, so 100 times, that will never be huge companies. Then there are projects where they have potential, maybe unlikely, but there's a chance that they could potentially become very large businesses in the future that are public companies that employ hundreds or thousands of people, right? A lot of the characteristics that I think about are actually not super different from how you would look at a traditional startup, right? Like, is the product addressing a market need that will be large enough or is large enough, ready, to support the creation of a very large company? There's a lot of specific things you can look at by identifying the market, researching the pain the customer has, how much capital the customer has across, whatever industry or many industries. You really look at a lot of those things. I would say not enough open source founders that I interact with and that I see building companies today really deeply evaluate this. They're living in sort of like a La La Land kind of fairy tale where they think the JSON parser they're building maybe it's going to be the next hashing or something, right? Probably unlikely. So you really have to think pretty deeply about, is your technology likely, if everything is executed really well or close to perfectly, to produce a great company and a huge company. And there's a lot of complexity to this. Open source projects are not a product. Open source projects are, like you were saying earlier, free. Anyone can use them. Anyone can contribute to them. Anyone can fork them and create a product around it if they want. But it's this open source community. And so when you create a company around a technology that has this super permissive, like free characteristic. Like it's very, very counterintuitive and difficult to construct a business model around that. And that's part of thing that I sort of think about a lot and I kind of specialize in is you have to really lean in to that tension and that counterintuitive friction by growing your community, growing your user base, and building something that could be, almost universally successful. And through doing that, you'll have many opportunities to create products and services around your technology or enabled by your technology that could be products you charge money for. They could be fully proprietary or partially proprietary. They could be reducing friction from how the customer uses that product. They could be integrating your technology in different ways that solve a business workflow. They could be, the basis for some kind of network where the company is actually less about your software, but more about the data that you collect and the network effects that you produce through activity from the users. There's many, many different ways of creating business models that are very case specific. But I would say probably the two biggest fundamental things that I pay attention to and I look for when I'm investing and helping build these kinds of companies very early on is founder with a product vision is probably the main thing. And the second thing would be independent of the founder, independent of the product vision, independent of the team. Does the technology itself have the characteristics where on its current trajectory without being, modified or changed in a massive way, and you scaled out the adoption and you scaled out the usage and the sort of success of that technology in the industry and the world, does it have the ability to produce a solution to a deep enough and painful enough problem for companies and customers where you could produce a really huge business? That is kind of primarily what I look at. And then the first part is kind of more important, but is less easy to describe, which is a founder with a product vision. What is a product vision? Product vision really, kind of means, does the founder actually have the ability to see into the future of, not just step 3 or step 4, but step 50 or step 500 about where they need to go from the current early stage, early signs of life of their project to building a set of capabilities for the users and for the customers where they can really shape the delivery of something that not just competes in an existing space and we're the alternative to XYZ, but can actually deliver a new kind of solution with maybe new language and new terminology and a new way of thinking about how you solve a problem. And it's hard to describe in quantitative ways what that really looks like when you talk to someone. But when you talk to someone who has that, it's night and day. It's very clear. Do they have that or do they not have that? And I try my best, and it's not always the case because you can help people with developing a product vision. But if you don't have a clear product vision, it is extremely difficult to build a very large successful company. So those I would say those are the two big things that I look at when I'm helping people.
Yeah, I'll begin the last part a little bit. So, like we have been talking about it since the start, that what is open core, what is COSS, and all these things. So you talked about knowing the founder knowing about step 0 to step 500 potentially, for example. So, but a lot of what we see in open source technology or in open source companies, actually COSS, is they're community dependent. Unlike closed source companies, in which the actual company or the leadership has the sole decision making power, in open source companies, does that lack? And if that lacks, then how do you how do you expect the founders to predict step 500, quote unquote?
Yeah, so I invest in companies. I don't invest in open source projects.
Yeah.
So that's the answer. My fund invests in founders who have the ability to take their open source projects as the basis for a lot of the fundamental building blocks of their company, but they still have to build the company. They still have to build the product. They still have to bring the product to market, still have to sell the product, and so on and so forth. Like I was saying earlier, the open source project is fundamentally different from the commercial product, right?
Yeah.
They're two totally different things. Many companies conflate the two. They say, oh, it's the same thing. That's a really big mistake. Don't do that. Every successful company in history, whether it's open source or not, requires leadership. It requires a vision, and it requires a strong founder with a very clear perspective of the future. And I have never seen a successful product built purely via the community. I've never seen that. I'm very interested in learning about this, if you have an example. But when you build a company, you have a very centralized, way of designing the strategy of how the product solves the pain point for the customer. And this is a very intimate process. It requires a lot of iteration and feedback, and sort of a high degree of vision and leadership from a small group of people, not from a decentralized kind of community. And so I tend to think of the open source project and the technology side of things as very different from the product itself and from the way you would actually go and deliver a solution to a customer.
Yeah. So the same thing that we're talking about, open technology versus the actual core company. Yeah, that I totally get it now. So people have to stop creating a big difference between open source and closed source. The product has to sell. That's the baseline. If you build on top, you build an open source or a product, not a project, venture backable, you will invest in, let's say, like in a real world. So how do you actually manage the company? Like practically, how do you manage the company? Is it different from how you manage a startup normally, or does it look like the same way? Is it the same thing?
It can be very different. So there's some really interesting differences actually. So commercial open source companies, oftentimes, this is a really interesting difference. Oftentimes the founders, not always, but actually quite often, the founders meet each other through the open source project. It's really fascinating. And sometimes because the open source project is so distributed, anyone can participate in the project. You can have someone on one side of the earth and the other person on the other side of the earth. Sometimes the founders meet through the project and they never physically meet in person for the first several months or maybe even years while building the company around the project. This is really incredible. So that's one big difference in terms of how the company is managed and run. The second big difference would be hiring in the company. Because the open source project sometimes has dozens or hundreds or maybe thousands of contributors, you don't have to go and hire a recruiter and put the ad on LinkedIn and pay for ads and say, we're hiring our first 5 engineers. We need to do 50 interviews. No, you just look at the commit graph of the open source project and you see who is the most active, who has added the most value to the project, and who's really invested and excited about this technology, and contact them and see if they're a good fit. And the interesting thing that I've noticed is probably 80% or more of the first 5 to 10, maybe 20 hires of open source companies are directly from the open source contributor community. So it's very, very interesting. The third thing I would say that's very different about open source companies in terms of how they're run and managed is the way the adoption works, right? Because open source is accessible for free and anyone can see it and it's transparent. And typically, if you're building a project in an open source technology that is valuable, it solves a lot of really critical problems, mostly for developers. The way you actually get your first 100 users or 1,000 users or 10,000 users, maybe even millions of users. I have a lot of investments with, I'm very lucky to have a lot of investments with, they have millions of users, and they paid $0 to acquire those users. The way you actually get your adoption from the open source community is like organic. You can see these like viral adoption mechanisms, and accessing those users, interacting with them is very different from building proprietary technology company, because your project doesn't collect the email ID and the name and all the contact information. So you typically have to build a website with like a contact form or some sign up flow or some some network or hub or something where you encourage people to sign up so you can help them more and you can get in touch with them. But the way adoption works is also very different. So my big grand theory about how you run and build open source companies actually is everything is different as compared to the traditional closed core proprietary software company way of building things. Everything can be different. Everything actually is different. And if you really understand why those things are true, you can take advantage of those differences in a lot of interesting ways.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, especially the adoption part. But so how does that adoption really take place? So how do products really get viral? Is it because the contributors, they make it go viral because it's like something they've contributed in and they have the pride of that to share it? Like really, what do you think makes that happen?
I don't know. That's a great question. I would say each project has different ways of getting awareness. Some projects are really good at writing blog posts and they get on the top of Hacker News all the time. Other projects are really good at engaging in a Reddit subreddit community and they get a lot of followers there. Other projects are really, really good at tweeting. So they have these tweet threads or X threads now where they're constantly tweeting about different things, and there's a lot of followers on Twitter, and that's how they actually get a lot of adoption. Each project is very different, but sometimes the contributors help with that. I think the developer community in general is very excited about more interesting, scalable, and powerful open source libraries and projects that come out. And so once something is created that solves a problem and is a better way of doing something that they had to pay for before was some proprietary thing, there's going to be a lot of excitement around that. And I think that's kind of a big reason why a lot of these projects see so much adoption so quickly. Because, you could sort of conceptually think like maybe there's a lot of this pent up demand, in the past. And there was a huge amount of developer, subliminally like interest in like, wow, if that thing, we're paying so much money for this thing, it's annoying, but it works. If that was open source, they're not even saying this in their head, but all of a sudden they saw it come up in their GitHub feed and they're like, oh my God, this thing's like open source now. And now there's going to be, hundreds or thousands of people jumping in on day one. And then the snowball starts rolling and rolling, and then the snowball gets bigger and bigger. So I have another final theory about this, which is I think eventually all digital technology, maybe even eventually all physical technology over time, that's a much bigger kind of topic, becomes open source. Because when an open source implementation of some invention starts to become available and it's stable and reliable enough, there's no reason why everyone would not want to use it. There's no reason, because it's just fundamentally better than having to pay money or having to be locked into something or having to be, And so a big missing piece to this in the open source world is design and user experience. A lot of the UI, UX, user experience of a lot of these open source projects are really shitty. And they're not investing a lot in the quality of the user experience or the quality of the workflow from the first click to delivering value to the user. And if the creators and the open source community really invested more in that, and I encourage a lot of our founders to do that, they would have even faster, even more excited communities and users for their projects.
Yep, that's a very interesting point. I think we'll take a hard stop here. I'll ask one last question, which I think I like to end with. So I've been into startups, VCs, and I've been coding since I was 11. So what do you think is one fact that you think will blow 11-year-old me mind?
The fact that you can do anything that your mind imagines today with greater impact than ever before in the history of humanity. The moment you realize that, that is, I think, a very transformative and powerful observation. But it's hard to realize that because you first have to sort of, the scope of your imagination has to be there and you have to be aware of this. And then you have to also think, wow, whatever I imagine in my head, I can make it happen and make it real. I think that's the most mind-blowing thing that you can probably imagine, especially with all the tools available now, with all the technology available and the internet. You really don't need a very powerful computer to do absolutely incredible things to impact the entire world. You can do it sitting anywhere in the world with an internet connection and a laptop.
Yeah, that's. I mean, most people lack the imagination. That's all. That yeah, this has been incredible. I think this was incredible. That's it from my side. Anything
Right.
you'd like to say?
No, I thank you for inviting me to your podcast, Advik, and I wish you all the best and continue doing what you're doing. You're already making an impact on the world by creating access to conversations with different people that can be useful for your audience. And so thank you for doing that.